It has been exactly 10 years since the referendum that changed the destiny of the United Kingdom forever. A decade ago, on that feverish night in June 2016, the streets of London were filled with the sound of popping champagne corks. People cheered about taking back control, believing they were witnessing the birth of a new golden age. Boris Johnson stood under the spotlights, painting a vision of a global Britain, a nation as efficient as Singapore and as free as a privateer on the high seas. But today, in 2026, if you walk into a cafe in the City of London or a pub in a struggling town in the north, you won't hear the sound of celebration. Instead, you'll hear a word that has moved from a niche social media hashtag to the very center of the national psyche: Bregret. It's a classic British portmanteau: Brexit plus regret. According to the latest polls, over 64% of Britons now believe that leaving the European Union was the greatest strategic blunder in the country's modern history. Among those under the age of 30, the generation that will inherit this island, that number skyrockets to over 80%. They feel they are living in the ruins of a decision they didn't make, stripped of the right to live and work across an entire continent. You might ask, how did they get here? Is it really that bad? Surely a maritime power that once commanded a global empire doesn't need a Brussels bureaucracy to survive? The reality of 2026 is far more haunting than the theory of 2016. Over the last 10 years, the UK hasn't just suffered a dip in GDP, it has experienced what feels like a forced uninstallation of its economic operating system. As we speak, the government is quietly pushing a controversial piece of legislation known as the Great Reset. It is a desperate, pragmatic attempt to realign British laws with European standards through the back door, just to keep the lights on. Critics are screaming from the sidelines, claiming that Britain is being turned into a satellite state, sovereign in name, but a servant in practice. They argue the country has traded its seat at the table for a spot in the waiting room. So, what happened? How did the global Britain dream turn into a Bregret reality? This isn't just a story about a country in decline, it's a story about the most expensive experiment in modern history regarding the price of sovereignty versus the cost of living. But here's the most stinging irony. Those hundreds of millions of pounds promised to be poured into the pockets of ordinary Brits every week, not only have they vanished, but the average British family is now checking the weather forecast in Spain just to see if they'll be able to afford fresh tomatoes. The truth behind this broken bank starts with a very famous, very red, and very misleading bus. To understand the depth of the frustration Brits are feeling today, you have to look back at the air castle that was sold to them in 2016. It was a masterpiece of political marketing built on a single intoxicating slogan: "Take back control." The centerpiece of this vision was that bright red campaign bus, emblazoned with a promise that has since become the most mocked sentence in British political history: "We send the EU $350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead." It suggested that Brexit wasn't just about identity, it was a literal jackpot. It told a struggling public that the keys to the national treasury were being held hostage in Brussels, and all they had to do was snatch them back to fix every hospital wing in the country. But the vision went far beyond healthcare. The architects of Brexit promised a global Britain. They painted a picture of a nation unshackled from what they called the corpse of the European Union, an organization they described as a slow, bureaucratic sinking ship. Once free, they argued, Britain would reclaim its heritage as a great maritime trading power. For the United States, this was particularly interesting because Brits were promised a massive, gold-standard trade deal with the US on day one. British voters were told that the world's rising giants, India, China, and the Gulf states, were all waiting in line to do business with a newly independent London. The promise was frictionless trade without the rules. They were told the UK could keep all the benefits of the European club without paying the membership fees. It was the ultimate have your cake and eat it strategy. And then there was the promise of the borders. By ending free movement, the Leave campaign promised to ease the pressure on housing and wages. They depicted a future where a points-based system would ensure only the best and brightest arrived, while the local working class would see their paychecks swell as competition for labor vanished. For millions of Brits, this wasn't just a policy change, it was an emotional rebirth. They dreamed of a Singapore-on-Thames, a nimble, high-tech nation outcompeting its neighbors, as if Brexit could magically fix every structural problem London had faced for decades. 10 years later, that red bus feels like a relic from a different planet. The British people are finding out that when you take back control of a complex machine by smashing it with a sledgehammer, you don't end up with a faster machine. You end up with a pile of broken parts. And nowhere is that breakage more apparent than in their ability to trade with the world. In the tech world, we talk about operating systems. If you try to uninstall the core OS while the computer is running, the whole machine crashes. That is exactly what happened here. For decades, the UK was the crown jewel of the European supply chain, but 10 years after the vote, that frictionless trade has been replaced by a mountain of paperwork. We're talking about non-tariff barriers, the invisible walls of bureaucracy. Take the Scottish salmon industry. 10 years ago, a crate of salmon reached Paris in less than 24 hours. Today, that same crate often rots at a port while a driver waits for a veterinarian to sign off on a health certificate that didn't exist a decade ago. While multinationals can absorb these costs of doing business, for thousands of small family firms, it was a death sentence. Many simply stopped exporting to Europe altogether. The numbers tell a story of a self-inflicted wound. The architects of Brexit bragged that new trade deals with Australia and New Zealand would herald a new era of prosperity. But official data in 2026 shows a grim reality. Those deals combined are estimated to add a measly 0.08% to the UK's GDP. Contrast that with the 4% long-term loss to the economy caused by leaving the European single market. It's like trading a 5-course meal for a single cracker. And then there's the global Britain promise that was supposed to land right on our doorstep. Brits were told that because of their special relationship with the US, a trade deal would be a slam dunk. But we know how that went. Between Washington's shift toward protectionism and concerns over the Northern Ireland border, that deal never materialized. The UK found itself in a geopolitical no-man's land, too small to dictate terms to DC or Beijing, and no longer part of the European bloc that gave them collective bargaining power. The result? The UK has become one of the slowest recovering economies in the G7. Britain remained weighed down by the Brexit anchor, but the pain isn't just about trade balances. It's about the people. It's about the realization that the only thing more expensive than being in a club with rules is being outside of it, while still having to follow them. To any American strategist, sovereignty is the most powerful word in politics. It was the ultimate drug of the Brexit campaign. But as we've learned, sovereignty in the 21st century is a trade-off, not a trophy. The Financial Times recently put it bluntly: Britain didn't leave the orbit of the European Union, it just moved into a position where it has to follow the gravity without being able to steer the planet. This is the sovereignty paradox. To keep selling goods to their neighbors, British companies still have to follow European rules. The difference is that 10 years ago, British ministers sat at the head of the table in Brussels and helped write those rules. Today, they sit in the waiting room, checking their phones to see what the EU has decided for them. They've gone from being a rule maker to a rule taker. To make matters worse, London has spent billions of pounds creating British versions of agencies that already existed for medicines, chemicals, and aviation. As one disgruntled CEO told the BBC, "We now have to pay twice for the same certificate and run 2 sets of tests just to sell the same widget. It's not independence, it's a tax on existence." By 2026, the government has realized this is costing the country its competitive edge. They are navigating the impossible triangle. You can have absolute sovereignty, economic efficiency, or low prices, but never all three. In a move to lower the cost of living, the government has begun using Henry VIII powers to quietly realign British standards with European ones. Prime Minister Starmer recently defended this by saying, "Ideology doesn't pay the electricity bill, pragmatism does." But for hardline Brexiteers, this feels like a betrayal, the creation of a vassal state. The UK took back the steering wheel, only to find they no longer have any say in where the road is built. And while Westminster argues over legal alignment, the real damage is felt at the kitchen table. As it turns out, you can't eat sovereignty. For United States, the Irish border was always the tripwire. presidents from both sides of the aisle made it clear to London, don't you dare touch the Good Friday Agreement. But the laws of trade are stubborn. To avoid a hard border on land, the UK government did the unthinkable. They drew a border down the middle of their own country, the Irish Sea. By 2026, this has created a surreal economic paradox. Because Northern Ireland essentially has 1 foot in the UK and 1 foot in the EU single market, it has become the fastest growing region in the country. While factories in Manchester drown in paperwork, a warehouse in Belfast can ship to both London and Paris with zero friction. As one local business leader told The Economist, we are the only place on earth that actually got the best of both worlds that the Brexiteers promised everyone else. The irony is, we only got it by being half in the EU. But this economic miracle has come at a staggering political cost. For the Unionists, this sea border feels like a betrayal. They feel evicted from their own country. Meanwhile, Irish unification is no longer a romantic dream. In 2026, it's a mathematical probability. As a prominent political analyst recently noted in the Irish Times, Brexit didn't just take Britain out of Europe, it acted as a solvent, dissolving the glue that held the 4 nations of the UK together. In Scotland, where 60% voted to stay in 2016, the sentiment is even more toxic. The SNP's message in 2026 is simple. We didn't leave the EU. We were dragged out of it against our will. The UK was supposed to emerge as a global superpower. Instead, it is fighting to keep its own map from tearing apart. The act of taking back control in London has led to a loss of control over Belfast and Edinburgh. The question in British politics has shifted from the will of the people to the survival of the nation. How does a proud country admit a mistake without saying the words? The answer is the Great Reset. Under Keir Starmer, the UK is performing a massive, quiet U-turn. They aren't reapplying for EU membership. That would be political suicide. Instead, they are rejoining through the back door. The centerpiece is dynamic alignment, a bureaucratic term for a radical reality. The UK is voluntarily adopting EU laws on food and manufacturing just to stop the bleeding at the borders. A primary driver for this shift is a demographic ticking time bomb. In 2016, age was the single greatest predictor of how a person would vote, and 10 years later, that divide has hardened into a wall of resentment. The Bregret index among British youth is staggering. Over 80% of those under 30 now want back in. They are the lost generation of Brexit, watching their horizons shrink while their peers in Dublin or Berlin enjoy the mobility they were stripped of. While the older generation voted for nostalgia, the young are the ones paying the invoice. It is the ultimate irony of the decade. The UK left to take back control, but has become a satellite state, following rules made in Brussels with no vote and no voice, simply because the cost of being independent became too high. Even in defense and security, the global Britain dream has folded into a comprehensive security pact with Europe. As one senior diplomat noted, in a world of giants like the US and China, an island of 67 million people can't afford to be a lonely rock in the Atlantic. So was it worth it? 10 years on, Brexit looks less like a liberation and more like an incredibly expensive, decade-long detour. The UK is moving back into the European neighborhood, but with a much smaller house and a lot less influence. The lesson is a cold one for any mid-sized power in the 21st century. Sovereignty isn't just a flag or a slogan. It's the ability to provide a future for your people. Britain has stopped running away because as the world has watched over this turbulent decade, one truth has become undeniable. A sovereign kingdom with an empty fridge is just a lonely island. The thunderous roar of the referendum has, 10 years later, finally quieted into a long, hollow echo of regret.